Thunder. August 1926. The kind that rattles windows and sends servants scrambling to close shutters. Sarasota Bay, Florida. The sky bruises purple over the Gulf of Mexico, and on the southern tip of a private peninsula, the sun rises from the shoreline like a fever dream. 32 rooms. Venetian Gothic towers. Terracotta tiles imported from Barcelona. This is the palace John Ringling built with circus money. Blood money, some said. The fortune of a man who turned human spectacle into an empire worth $200 million in today's currency. But here's the thing about palaces built on sawdust and sequins. They don't last. Because on that August night in 1926, as lightning splits the sky over Sarasota, John Ringling stands in his ballroom surrounded by Venetian glass and gilded ceilings, and he has no idea. No idea that within 10 years, his fortune will evaporate. His wife will be dead. His circus will collapse. And the this monument to excess, this Venetian palace transplanted to Florida swampland, will become a mausoleum. A prison. A reminder that you can't buy immortality. Not with all the circus money in the world. Before we step inside, hit that subscribe button. We are documenting the rise and fall of America's greatest dynasties, and you won't want to miss the next episode. Because this isn't just about a circus tycoon. This is about what happens when you build a dream on other people's suffering. When you confuse wealth with security. When you believe your own publicity. And when the fortune runs out, and the creditors come calling, and all you're left with is a palace you can't afford to heat. Let's go back. To 1884. Baraboo, Wisconsin. 5 brothers. August, Otto, Alfred, Charles, and John Ringling. Poor. The sons of a harness maker. They grew up watching traveling shows. Medicine shows. Minstrel shows. Circuses. And they saw opportunity. Not art. Not entertainment. Opportunity. Because circuses made money. Lots of it. In an America with no movies, no radio, no television, live entertainment was everything. And circuses were the biggest spectacle available. The Ringling brothers started small. A backyard show. Tumbling. Juggling. Music. They charged admission. Pennies. But it was enough. They reinvested. Bought a tent. Hired performers. A strongman. A juggler. A clown. By 1884, they had a real circus. The Ringling Brothers Circus. They traveled by wagon. Town to town. Performing in fields. In barns. Wherever they could draw a crowd. The business model was simple. Hype. Spectacle. Volume. They advertised heavily. Posters plastered on every barn and fence. Promising the greatest show on earth. Even though they weren't. Not yet. But the hype worked. People came. And the Ringlings made money. They didn't just perform. They controlled every aspect. Owned the tents. Owned the wagons. Hired the performers as contractors. Paid them as little as possible. Kept the profits. And the profits grew. By 1890, the Ringling Brothers Circus was one of the largest traveling shows in America. They had lions. Tigers. Elephants. Trapeze artists. High-wire acts. Exotic animals shipped from Africa and Asia. Performers recruited from Europe. The best aerialists. The best acrobats. The best freaks. Because that's what sold tickets. Freaks. People with deformities. Displayed like animals. The bearded lady. The giant. The dwarf. The Siamese twins. Human beings reduced to curiosities. Paraded in front of crowds. Gawked at. Mocked. And the Ringlings made a fortune off their suffering. But they didn't see it as suffering. They saw it as business. As opportunity. As the price of success. And John Ringling, the youngest of the brothers, he was the most ruthless. He understood leverage. Understood competition. Understood that in the circus business, you either dominated or you died. So he dominated. In 1907, the Ringling brothers bought their biggest competitor. The Barnum and Bailey Circus. The greatest show on earth. The merger created a monopoly. The Ringling brothers and Barnum and Bailey combined shows. They controlled 70% of the American circus market. Owned the best performers. The best acts. The best routes. And they crushed anyone who tried to compete. Smaller circuses were bought out. Or destroyed. If a rival circus came to town, the Ringlings would book the same dates. Underprice them. Outspend them on advertising. Drive them out of business. Then buy their assets. Their tents. Their animals. Their performers. For pennies on the dollar. It was brutal. Effective. And enormously profitable. By 1920, John Ringling's personal net worth was estimated at $50 million. $1.5 billion today. He was one of the richest men in America. Richer than most industrialists. All from circus money. But John wanted more. He wanted legitimacy. Wanted to be seen as more than a circus owner. He wanted to be a tycoon. A mogul. A patron of the arts. So he started investing. Real estate. Railroads. Oil. He bought land in Florida. Thousands of acres in Sarasota. Undeveloped. Cheap. Because Florida in the 1920s was a frontier. Hot. Humid. Mosquito-infested. But John saw potential. Saw that Florida would boom. That the wealthy would come. Looking for sunshine. For beaches. For escape from northern winters. So he bought. And he was right. The Florida land boom exploded in the 1920s. Property values skyrocketed. Land John bought for $100 an acre sold for $10,000. 100 times return. Overnight, John's net worth doubled. Then tripled. By 1925, he was worth over $100 million. $3 billion today. He owned railroads. Banks. Hotels. Entire islands. And he decided it was time to build. To prove he had arrived. To show the world that John Ringling, the circus tycoon, the son of a harness maker, belonged among America's elite. He chose a location. A peninsula on Sarasota Bay. Pristine. Isolated. 66 acres. Waterfront on 3 sides. He called it Bird Key. And he hired architects. Not American architects. He wanted European. He wanted grandeur. He hired Dwight James Baum. A New York architect who specialized in Mediterranean revival. But John didn't just want Mediterranean. He wanted Venetian. He wanted a palace that looked like it belonged on the Grand Canal. He wanted Ca di Zon. House of John. In Venetian dialect. Construction began in 1924. The timing was perfect. The Florida boom was at its peak. Money was flowing. John had cash. Lots of it. And he spent it. Lavishly. The foundation alone cost $50,000. $1.5 million today. Because building on Florida swampland requires deep pilings. Steel and concrete driven 30 feet into the ground. To support the weight of the structure. The walls were brick. Red brick. Hand-laid. Covered in stucco. Painted terracotta. To mimic Venetian palazzos. The roof tiles were imported. From Barcelona. Clay tiles. Hand-fired. Each one weighing 5 pounds. 30,000 tiles. Shipped across the Atlantic. Each tile cost $5. 150 today. 30,000 tiles. $4.5 million. Just for the roof. The tower, the signature feature of Ca. Dizon, rose 5 stories. 81 feet. Venetian Gothic. Pointed arches. Decorative brickwork. A bell tower. With a real bell. Cast in Italy. Shipped to Florida. The tower cost $75,000. $2.3 million today. For decoration. For ego. Because John wanted people to see Ca. Dizon from miles away. Wanted them to know that John Ringling had arrived. The interior was even more extravagant. 32 rooms. But not just rooms. Showpieces. The ballroom was the crown jewel. 40 feet long. 30 feet wide. Ceilings 20 feet high. The floor was terrazzo. Italian marble chips set in cement. Polished to a mirror shine. The walls were painted. Frescoes. Scenes from Venetian history. Commissioned from artists in Italy. Painted on canvas. Shipped to Florida. Installed panel by panel. The cost of the frescoes alone was $100,000. $3 million today. The ceiling was painted to look like the sky. Blue. Clouds. Angels. Gold leaf accents. Hundreds of hours of handwork. By Italian craftsmen brought over specifically for this project. The chandeliers. Oh, the chandeliers. There were 3 of them in the ballroom. Murano glass. From Venice. Each one custom-made. Hand-blown glass. Crystal. Each chandelier weighed over 1,000 pounds. Cost $50,000. $1.5 million today. Per chandelier. 3 chandeliers. $4.5 million. For lighting. The dining room seated 24. The table was mahogany. Hand-carved. 16 feet long. The chairs were upholstered in silk. Imported from France. Gold thread. Each chair cost $3,000. 90,000 today. 24 chairs. $2.1 million. 4 chairs. The china was custom designed. Porcelain. Made in Bavaria. Hand painted. Each piece featured the Ca. Dizon crest. A lion. Rampant. Because John fancied himself a lion. King of the circus. Each place setting cost $800. 24,000 today. 24 settings. $576,000. 4 plates. John's office was on the 2nd floor. Dark wood paneling. Mahogany. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Filled with leather-bound books. Most of which John never read. But they looked impressive. And that was the point. His desk was massive. 10 feet long. Hand-carved. Cost $15,000. $450,000 today. For a desk. The master bedroom suite occupied the entire south wing. John and his wife, Mabel, had separate bedrooms. Connected by a shared sitting room. Mabel's bedroom was feminine. Pale pink walls. Silk drapes. French furniture. Louis XVI style. Gilded. Her bed was a 4-poster. Draped in silk and lace. Custom made. Cost $20,000. $600,000 today. Her bathroom was pink marble. Italian. The bathtub was carved from a single block. Cost $10,000. $300,000 today. Gold fixtures. Because Mabel wanted the best. John's bedroom was more masculine. Dark wood. Leather. But no less expensive. His bathroom was green marble. Also Italian. Gold fixtures. A custom shower. With 8 shower heads. Because John wanted to feel like he was standing in a waterfall. The guest rooms, there were 10 of them, were equally elaborate. Each one themed. The Venetian room. The gold room. The blue room. Each with its own bathroom. Marble. Gold fixtures. Custom tiles. Because guests at Ca Dizon weren't just visitors. They were witnesses. To John's success. To his wealth. To his arrival. The cost of building Ca Dizon was staggering. $1.5 million. $45 million today. Just for construction. That doesn't include the furnishings. The art. John and Mabel were art collectors. Obsessive art collectors. They traveled to Europe regularly. Buying paintings. Sculptures. Tapestries. They bought old masters. Rubens. Velázquez. Titian. Some authentic. Some forgeries. Because John had money but not always taste. Not always expertise. And dealers saw him coming. Sold him mediocre works at inflated prices. But John didn't care. He wanted quantity. Wanted his walls covered. Wanted to prove he was cultured. The art collection eventually included over 600 pieces. Valued, at the time, at over $5 million. $150 million today. But much of it was overvalued. Overpaid for. When it was eventually appraised after John's death, the true value was less than half. But in the 1920s, John believed he was building one of the great art collections in America. And maybe he was. By quantity, if not quality. The grounds of Ca Dizon were equally elaborate. Formal gardens. Designed by landscape architects from New York. Imported palm trees. Rare orchids. Exotic plants. A rose garden. Fountains. Statuary. A reflecting pool. A boathouse. Because Ca Dizon was on the water. Sarasota Bay. John wanted to arrive by boat. Wanted guests to arrive by boat. So he built a dock. A private marina. With space for yachts. John owned a yacht. A 120-foot luxury vessel. Custom built. Cost $500,000. $15 million today. Named the Xalophus. After a sea lion. Because everything in John's life connected back to the circus. The staff at Ca Dizon was enormous. 30 people. Living on the property. In servants' quarters. Behind the main house. Out of sight. Cooks. Maids. Butlers. Gardeners. Groundskeepers. Chauffeurs. A yacht captain. A yacht crew. Each one with a specific role. Each one essential to maintaining the illusion. The illusion that life at Ca Dizon was effortless. That wealth meant leisure. That the Ringlings were aristocracy. But it wasn't effortless. It was a machine. A machine that required constant feeding. Constant maintenance. Constant money. The head butler, a man named Thomas, managed the household. Supervised the staff. Made sure everything ran smoothly. He was paid $200 a month. $6,000 today. More than the other servants. But still a fraction of what John spent on a single dinner party. Thomas lived in a small apartment above the garage. No air conditioning. No luxury. Just a bed and a dresser. But he was loyal. Professional. He ran CADs on like a military operation. Because that's what it required. The cooks, there were 3 of them, worked in an industrial kitchen. In the basement. 6 gas stoves. Walk-in refrigerators. Zinc counters. Preparing meals for the Ringlings. For their guests. Sometimes for 50 people. Multi-course dinners. French cuisine. Because Mabel fancied herself a gourmand. The maids cleaned. Constantly. Because a house this size never stops needing cleaning. 32 rooms. Marble floors. Terrazzo. Windows. Dozens of windows. Chandeliers that had to be dusted. Crystal. Each piece removed. Cleaned. Replaced. It took a full day. Per chandelier. The gardeners maintained the grounds. 10 acres of formal gardens. Mowing. Trimming. Planting. Weeding. In Florida heat. In humidity. It was brutal work. They worked dawn to dusk. 6 days a week. Paid $50 a month. $1,500 today. For backbreaking labor. The cost of running CADs on was astronomical. $200,000 a year. $6 million today. Just in operating expenses. Salaries. Food. Utilities. Maintenance. Landscaping. $200,000. Every year. For a house the Ringlings used maybe 6 months a year. Because winters were spent in New York. Or traveling. Or at the circus. The circus. That's where the money came from. The Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey combined shows. By 1926, the circus was at its peak. Traveling to over 100 cities a year. Performing for millions of people. Generating enormous revenue. $10 million a year. $300 million today. And John owned a significant portion. His share of the profits was over $2 million a year. $60 million today. More than enough to support CADs on. More than enough to support his lifestyle. More than enough to feel secure. But John wasn't content. He kept expanding. Kept investing. Kept leveraging. He borrowed money. Used his circus shares as collateral. Used CADs on as collateral. Used his Florida land as collateral. To invest in more real estate. More railroads. More banks. Because the Florida boom was still going. And John believed it would go forever. That land values would keep rising. That the profits would keep flowing. That his fortune was infinite. But it wasn't. Nothing is infinite. And the invisible costs, the costs John didn't see, they were mounting. The heating bills at CADs on, even in Florida, were substantial. The house had a coal furnace. In the basement. Massive. It heated water. Circulated through radiators. In every room. Because even in Florida, winter nights can be cold. And John wanted comfort. Wanted guests to be comfortable. The furnace burned through tons of coal every month. Shipped from Pennsylvania. At enormous cost. Because Florida doesn't have coal. Everything had to be imported. The electric bills were equally staggering. CADs on was one of the first homes in Sarasota with full electricity. Generated by a private generator. Also in the basement. Running constantly. Powering lights. Appliances. The refrigerators. The fans. In a time when most homes had minimal electricity, Ca.'s blazed with light. Every room. Every chandelier. Every lamp. It was a statement. But it was expensive. Thousands of dollars a month. Just for electricity. The isolation of Ca.'s was both intentional and tragic. John chose Bird Key because it was removed. Private. Accessible only by boat or a single road. He wanted privacy. Wanted to control who came and went. Wanted to create his own world. Where he was king. But isolation breeds loneliness. And Mabel, John's wife, she felt it. She had grown up in Ohio. Middle class. She married John when he was already successful. Already wealthy. But still connected to the circus. Still traveling. Still engaged with the world. Ca.'s changed that. Once it was built, John became obsessed with it. With maintaining it. With showing it off. He hosted parties. Elaborate parties. Hundreds of guests. Politicians. Businessmen. Celebrities. But they weren't friends. They were contacts. Business connections. People John was trying to impress. Trying to leverage. And Mabel, she played her role. The gracious hostess. The cultured wife. But she was lonely. Isolated. Trapped in a palace that felt more like a stage than a home. She spent her days in the garden. Tending to her roses. Or in her sitting room. Painting. She was an artist. A real artist. Before she married John. But after Ca.'s her art became a hobby. A distraction. Something to fill the empty hours. John was rarely home. Always traveling. To New York. To the circus. To business meetings. To Europe buying art. He left Mabel at Ca.'s with the servants. With the empty rooms. With the loneliness. And she resented it. Resented the house. Resented the isolation. Resented John. But she never said it. Because that wasn't her role. Her role was to be the perfect wife. The perfect hostess. The perfect ornament in John's perfect palace. Then, 1926. The same year Ca.'s was completed. The Florida land boom collapsed. Overnight. Land values plummeted. Properties that sold for $10,000 an acre were suddenly worth $100,000. A 99% loss. Developers went bankrupt. Banks failed. The Florida economy crashed. And John, who had leveraged everything, who had borrowed millions against his land holdings, he was exposed. His assets were suddenly worth a fraction of what he owed. His net worth, on paper, dropped from $100 million to $20 million. An 80% loss. In months. But John wasn't worried. Not yet. Because he still had the circus. The circus was still profitable. Still generating millions. And John believed the land would recover. That it was just a temporary correction. That Florida would boom again. But it didn't. The land stayed depressed. For years. And then, October 1929. The stock market crashed. Black Tuesday. The Great Depression began. And everything changed. The circus, the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey combined shows, it was hit hard. Attendance dropped. People had no money. Couldn't afford tickets. Even cheap tickets. Families that used to go to the circus every year. They stopped. They couldn't. They were struggling to eat. To pay rent. The circus wasn't a priority. Revenue dropped. From $10 million a year to $5 million. Then to $3 million. The circus was still operating. Still traveling. But barely breaking even. And John's share of the profits? It evaporated. From $2 million a year to $500,000. Then to $100,000. Then to nothing. The circus was losing money. And John, as the primary owner, he was responsible. He had to cover the losses. Out of his own pocket. But his pockets were emptying. Fast. Dizon became a burden. A weight. The $200,000 a year in operating costs. John couldn't afford it. Not anymore. He started cutting. Reduced the staff. From 30 to 20. Then to 15. Stopped hosting parties. Stopped traveling. Stopped buying art. But even with the cuts, Dizon was draining his remaining assets. And then, 1929. Mabel got sick. Diabetes. Addison's disease. A combination of conditions that, in the 1920s, were manageable but not curable. She needed constant care. Medications. Treatments. John hired nurses. Doctors. Specialists. He spared no expense. Because despite everything, despite the distance, despite the resentment, he loved her. Or at least, he loved the idea of her. The idea of the perfect wife. The perfect partner. The perfect ornament in his perfect palace. Mabel deteriorated rapidly. The disease ravaged her body. She lost weight. Lost strength. Spent most of her days in bed. In her pale pink bedroom. Staring out the windows at the bay. At the gardens she had designed. That she could no longer visit. John was frantic. Desperate. He brought in the best doctors. From New York. From Europe. But there was nothing they could do. The diseases were progressive. Fatal. On June 8, 1929, Mabel Ringling died. She was 54 years old. She died at Dizon. In her bed. With John beside her. Holding her hand. Begging her not to leave. But she left. And John was shattered. Not just emotionally. Financially. Because Mabel's medical bills were enormous. Over $500,000. $15 million today. And that was just the beginning. The funeral was elaborate. John insisted. A massive service. In Sarasota. Thousands attended. The circus community. Business associates. Society figures. Mabel was buried in a mausoleum. That John commissioned. Built on the grounds of what would become the Ringling Museum. Marble. Ornate. Cost $50,000. $1.5 million today. For a tomb. But the costs didn't stop. Mabel's will left her share of the assets, including her share of Dizon, to John. But there were estate taxes. Inheritance taxes. In 1929, the tax rate was 20%. 20% of Mabel's half of the estate. Which was valued at $10 million. $200,000 in taxes. $6 million today. John had to pay. In cash. Within 6 months. But he didn't have cash. His assets were illiquid. Tied up in the circus. In land that couldn't be sold. In Dizon. Which no one wanted to buy. So he borrowed. Again. Used the circus as collateral. Again. Took loans from banks. At high interest rates. Because the banks knew he was desperate. And desperate men pay. John paid. But the debt was mounting. And the circus was still losing money. By 1930, the circus was in crisis. Attendance had dropped by 70%. Revenue was a fraction of what it had been. The animals still needed to be fed. The performers still needed to be paid. The trains still needed to run. But there was no money. John tried to keep it afloat. Poured his remaining personal fortune into the circus. Sold assets. Sold land. At massive losses. Because he had to sell quickly. In a depressed market. He got pennies on the dollar. But it wasn't enough. In 1932, the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey combined shows filed for bankruptcy. Not full liquidation. But reorganization. Creditors took control. John was pushed out. Removed from leadership. The circus he had built. The empire his brothers had created. It was gone. Out of his hands. And John, the circus tycoon, the man who had been worth $100 million, he was broke. His net worth was less than $1 million. And most of that was CADs on. Which he couldn't sell. Couldn't afford to maintain. Couldn't escape. John retreated. Into CADs on. Into isolation. He fired. Most of the remaining staff. Kept only 3. A cook. A maid. A groundskeeper. The gardens, once immaculate, grew wild. The fountain stopped working. The statuary cracked. The paint peeled. The house, this palace that had cost $1.5 million to build, it began to decay. The roof leaked. Florida rain is relentless. The tiles, those expensive Barcelona tiles, they cracked. Let water in. Damaged the ceilings. The frescoes. Water stains spread across the painted canvases. Across the scenes of Venetian history. Ruining them. John couldn't afford repairs. Couldn't afford to replace the tiles. So he put buckets under the leaks. Dozens of buckets. Throughout the house. Catching the rain. The marble floors, once polished to a mirror shine, grew dull. Dirty. The terrazzo cracked. Because Florida swampland shifts. Settles. And the foundation, those expensive pilings, they weren't enough. The house shifted. Walls cracked. Doors wouldn't close. Windows wouldn't open. The chandeliers, those Murano glass masterpieces, they gathered dust. The crystal dulled. Some of the glass pieces fell. Shattered on the floor. John left them. Couldn't afford to repair them. Couldn't bear to look at them. Because every broken piece was a reminder. Of what he had. Of what he lost. John's health deteriorated. He was 70 years old. Decades of stress. Rich food. Alcohol. Cigars. It took a toll. He developed heart problems. High blood pressure. Chronic pain. He couldn't walk without a cane. Could barely climb stairs. He spent most of his days in his office. Sitting at that $15,000 desk. Staring at ledgers. At debt statements. At foreclosure notices. Because the creditors were circling. The banks wanted their money. The loans John had taken, using the circus as collateral. The circus was bankrupt. The collateral was worthless. The banks wanted CADs on. Wanted the land. Wanted anything they could liquidate. John fought. Hired lawyers. The best he could afford. Which wasn't much. He filed motions. Delays. Appeals. Trying to keep CADs on. Because it was all he had left. His last asset. His last symbol. His last proof that he had mattered. That he had built something. But he was losing. Slowly. Inevitably. In 1936, the court ruled. Foreclosure. Ca. Dizon would be seized. Sold at auction. To pay John's debts. John was given 6 months. To vacate. To find somewhere else to go. But he didn't leave. Couldn't leave. Because where would he go? He had no money. No friends. No family left. His brothers were dead. Mabel was dead. He was alone. So he stayed. In Ca. Dizon. Waiting. On December 2, 1936, John Ringling died. He was 70 years old. He died at Ca. Dizon. In his bed. Alone. The maid found him the next morning. Cold. Still. Gone. The funeral was small. A handful of people. Some former business associates. A few circus performers. Old-timers who remembered the glory days. John was buried next to Mabel. In the mausoleum he had built. The mausoleum that cost $50,000. The last extravagance. The will was read a week later. John's estate was valued at $300,000. $9 million today. Almost all of it was Ca. Dizon. The house. The land. The furnishings. The art. But there were debts. Enormous debts. Over $1 million. $30 million today. More than the estate was worth. The creditors fought. For years. In court. Over what was left. Over who got what. The lawyers took their fees. Hundreds of thousands. The banks took what they could. Sold assets at auction. The art collection. Those 600 pieces. Sold for $100,000. $3 million today. A fraction of what John paid. Because much of it was overvalued. Or fake. The furnishings. Sold. The chandeliers. The furniture. The rugs. Piece by piece. At auction. For pennies on the dollar. Ca. Dizon itself was harder to sell. Because who wanted a 32-room palace in Florida? During the Depression. No one. Not at any price. The house sat empty. For years. The bank that owned it couldn't sell it. Couldn't maintain it. So it decayed. Windows broke. Vandals got in. Stole what was left. Copper pipes. Light fixtures. Anything of value. The gardens, once a showpiece, turned into jungle. Florida vegetation is aggressive. Vines climbed the walls. Trees grew through the pathways. The fountains filled with leaves and algae. The reflecting pool became a swamp. The house that had cost $1.5 million to build. That had been the crown jewel of the Florida coast. Was now a ruin. Abandoned. Forgotten. Haunted by the ghost of John Ringling. The circus tycoon who built a dream. And lost everything. In 1946, 10 years after John's death, the state of Florida acquired Ca. Dizon. As part of a legal settlement. The creditors had given up. Accepted a fraction of what they were owed. Just to close the books. The state didn't want the house. Didn't know what to do with it. But they took it. Because it came with the Ringling Museum. Which John had also built. And deeded to the state in his will. As a final act of ego. A final attempt at legacy. The museum opened in 1948. But Ca. Dizon remained closed. Too expensive to restore. Too damaged. Too much. For decades, it sat. Empty. Decaying. A monument to excess. To greed. To the cost of building your identity on wealth. On spectacle. On the suffering of others. Because that's what the circus was. Suffering. The performers. Paid poorly. Worked to exhaustion. Injured regularly. Killed sometimes. The animals. Beaten. Starved. Chained. Paraded for profit. The freaks. Exploited. Dehumanized. Turned into commodities. John built his fortune on their backs. Built CADs on with their labor. Their pain. Their humiliation. And when the fortune collapsed. When the circus went bankrupt. When John died alone in his palace. The performers were left with nothing. No pensions. No retirement. No safety net. They moved on. Found other work. Other circuses. Or left the industry entirely. Broken. Forgotten. Just like CADs on. In 1991, the Ringling Museum finally began restoring CADs on. 45 years after the state acquired it. The restoration cost $20 million. $620 million today. More than 10 times what it cost to build. Because decades of neglect had taken their toll. The roof had to be completely replaced. Every tile. 30,000 tiles. Again. The frescoes had to be restored. Panel by panel. By Italian craftsmen. Again. The chandeliers had to be repaired. Piece by piece. The marble floors had to be repolished. The terrazzo repaired. The plumbing. The electrical. Everything. Rebuilt. Restored. Returned to its former glory. The restoration was meticulous. Accurate. Beautiful. And when it was finished, CADs on looked exactly as it had in 1926. The year it was completed. The year before everything fell apart. Today, CADs on is a museum. Open to the public. You can tour it. Walk through the ballroom. See the chandeliers. The frescoes. The terrazzo floors. You can stand on the terrace. Look out at Sarasota Bay. At the water John loved. You can visit Mabel's pink bedroom. See where she died. You can see John's office. The desk. The bookshelves. The ledgers that documented his fall. And you can feel it. The emptiness. The weight. The tragedy. Because CADs on isn't a celebration. It's a warning. The current state of CADs on is pristine. Perfect. Every detail restored. Every surface polished. But it's not a home. It's a museum. A monument. A mausoleum. The rooms are roped off. You can look but not touch. Not sit. Not live. Because no one lives there. No one could. It's too big. Too expensive. Too haunted. The heating bills alone, if someone tried to live there today, would be astronomical. $50,000 a month. Just for climate control. Because Florida is hot. Humid. And a house this size, with this much glass, this much marble, it's impossible to cool efficiently. The maintenance costs would be equally staggering. $1 million a year. Just to keep it from falling apart. Because Florida weather is brutal. Salt air corrodes metal. Humidity rots wood. Rain damages everything. CADs on requires constant vigilance. Constant repair. Constant money. Which is why no one lives there. Why no one could. It's not a home. It's a burden. A beautiful, tragic burden. The financial lesson of CADs on is clear. Brutal. You can build a palace. You can spend millions. You can import tiles from Barcelona and chandeliers from Venice and marble from Italy. You can fill your walls with art and your rooms with antiques. You can hire 30 servants and host elaborate parties and convince yourself that you've arrived. That you're untouchable. That your fortune is secure. But it's not. Fortunes are fragile. Markets crash. Businesses fail. And when they do, when the money stops flowing, the palace becomes a prison. The assets become liabilities. And the dream becomes a nightmare. John Ringling built Ca Dizon at the peak of his fortune. When he had $100 million. When the circus was thriving. When Florida land was booming. He spent $1.5 million. $45 million today. Plus hundreds of thousands a year in operating costs. And he believed he could afford it. Believed the money would keep coming. Forever. But it didn't. The land boom collapsed. The stock market crashed. The circus went bankrupt. And John, who had been worth $100 million, died with $300,000. And $1 million in debt. The estate taxes. The inheritance taxes. They destroyed what was left. When Mabel died, John had to pay $200,000 in taxes. $6 million today. Cash. Immediately. He didn't have it. So he borrowed. At high interest. And the debt compounded. When John died, his estate owed more than it was worth. Everything was liquidated. The art. The furnishings. The house. Sold. At auction. At massive losses. Because liquidation sales, especially during economic downturns, they're brutal. You get a fraction of the value. John paid $600,000 for his art collection. $18 million today. It sold for $100,000. $3 million. An 83% loss. Because much of it was overvalued. Or fake. John had been swindled. By dealers who saw a rich man with more money than sense. And they took advantage. Sold him mediocre works at premium prices. And John, desperate to prove he was cultured, he bought. Without question. Without expertise. The trust fund. John had set up a trust fund. For Mabel. To protect her. In case something happened to him. The trust was worth $5 million. $150 million today. Invested in circus stock. In Florida land. In assets that seemed secure. But when the markets crashed. When the circus went bankrupt. When the land became worthless. The trust evaporated. By the time Mabel died, it was worth less than $500,000. $15 million today. A 90% loss. And that money, what was left, it went to taxes. To debts. To lawyers. Mabel's family saw almost nothing. The foreclosure. When Ca Dizon was foreclosed. When the bank seized it. John had 6 months to vacate. But he didn't. He stayed. Because he had nowhere else to go. And the bank didn't force him. Because what were they going to do? Evict a dying old man. So they let him stay. Until he died. And then they took it. The auction of Ca Dizon's contents. It happened in 1937. A few months after John's death. The bank organized it. Advertised it. People came from all over Florida. Curiosity seekers. Bargain hunters. Dealers. They walked through the rooms. Pointed at the chandeliers. The furniture. The art. Placed bids. Low bids. Because everyone knew the bank was desperate. Had to sell. The 3 chandeliers in the ballroom. The Murano glass masterpieces. Each one cost $50,000 to commission. $1.5 million today. They sold for $3,000 each. 93,000. Today. A 94% loss. The mahogany dining table. Cost $15,000. 450,000 today. Sold for $500. 15,500 today. A 97% loss. The custom china. Bavaria porcelain. Gold rimmed. Cost $19,000 for the full set. 589,000 today. Sold for $200. 6,200 today. A 99% loss. Everything sold for a fraction of its value. Because that's what happens in liquidation. When you're forced to sell. When everyone knows you have no choice. They lowball you. And you take it. Because you have to. The invisible costs. The costs John didn't see. Didn't calculate. Didn't understand. They destroyed him. The operating expenses. $200,000 a year. Year after year. For a house used part-time. The opportunity cost. The money spent on CADs on could have been invested. Diversified. Protected. Instead, it was sunk into brick and marble. Into an illiquid asset. That couldn't be sold when he needed cash. The emotional cost. The isolation. The pressure. The performance. John spent his life performing. Trying to prove he belonged. Trying to impress people who didn't respect him. Trying to buy acceptance. With a palace. With parties. With excess. But it didn't work. The old money families. The Philadelphia elite. The New York aristocracy. They came to his parties. Ate his food. Admired his house. But they never accepted him. Never saw him as one of them. To them, he was always a circus tycoon. New money. No matter how big his palace. No matter how expensive his chandeliers. And John knew it. And it ate at him. Drove him to spend more. To build bigger. To prove himself. But the harder he tried. The more desperate he seemed. The more he proved their point. That he didn't belong. That he would never belong. The physical cost. The stress. The anxiety. The sleepless nights. John worked himself to death. Literally. Trying to maintain the circus. Trying to pay the debts. Trying to keep CADs on. He died at 70. Of heart failure. Caused by stress. By decades of pressure. Of performance. Of trying to be someone he wasn't. The lesson. The brutal, unavoidable lesson. Is that you can't buy happiness. Can't buy security. Can't buy legacy. With a palace. John built CADs on to prove he had arrived. To cement his place among America's elite. To create a legacy. But his legacy isn't CADs on. His legacy is bankruptcy. Is foreclosure. Is dying alone. In a house he couldn't afford. Surrounded by possessions he couldn't keep. His legacy is a warning. About the cost of ego. About the danger of building your identity on wealth. About the fragility of fortunes. About the emptiness of palaces. CADs on stands today. Beautiful. Restored. Perfect. But empty. No one lives there. No one will. It's a museum. A monument. A reminder. That the palace doesn't make you a king. That wealth doesn't make you secure. That excess doesn't make you happy. John Ringling built CADs on with circus money. Money earned from the suffering of others. From exploited performers. Beaten animals. Dehumanized freaks. He turned their pain into profit. And used that profit to build a dream. But dreams built on suffering don't last. They crumble. They decay. They become nightmares. And John, in the end, lived in that nightmare. In a palace that became a prison. In a dream that became a burden. In a monument that became a tomb. The circus is gone. Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey closed in 2017. After 146 years. Declining attendance. Rising costs. Changing values. People didn't want to see animals in cages anymore. Didn't want to see performers risk their lives. Didn't want the spectacle. The circus that John built. That his brothers started. That made them all rich. It's dead. Extinct. A relic of a bygone era. And ca dizon. It remains. Outlived the circus. Outlived John. Outlived the fortune. Because buildings, even empty ones, even burdensome ones, they endure. Long after the money is gone. Long after the people are dead. Long after the dream has faded. Ca dizon endures. As a warning. As a lesson. As a monument to the tragic fall of a circus tycoon. Who built a Mediterranean palace on Florida's swampland. And lost everything.